Good evening, everybody. Welcome to a panel discussion we are having about the midterms in the US. We're having it at the European School Frankfurt Rhein-Main. It's Gita over there. Thank you very much, Gita, and the staff and everybody from Europäische Schule, from European School Frankfurt Rhein-Main, that we can be your guests tonight. And also, I would like to say thank you for the teamwork once again. I mean, this is probably the number 7 or number 8 of events we're having together, Newcomers Network and European School Frankfurt Rhein-Main. Thank you very much for having us tonight. Thank you also Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, DGAP, that we are having the panel discussion tonight together. Thank you very much, Christoph Kehr von Plettenberg. Christoph, you and me, we're doing the moderation together. That's the plan. And we're having the talk, the chat with the panelists tonight about, once again, about the midterm election in America. We also decided to have it in English, since they're probably out there online because it's a live chat production tonight. We're having guests in the chat. We're having guests here tonight, and maybe there's some of you who don't speak German. That's why we decided to have the whole discussion in English. It's on the panel we have, or maybe we start not on the panel here, but we start on the panel in Washington. So we go to our online guest. It's Hannah Winneck. Hannah, you're the director of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Washington, DC, in the Washington office. Thank you very much for being with us. What time do you have in Washington at the moment?
It's 1:30.
1:30.
Afternoon, yeah.
So you
just
still
a few
have
minutes.
You still have the whole afternoon in front of you. Thank you very much for being with us. I would just quickly say thank you and say announce your names, and then I would like you to introduce yourself with a few sentences, and then a handover to you, Christoph. Tyson Barker, you're the program manager, technology and foreign policy, the German Council of the Foreign Relations, the DGAP. Then it's Alex. Thank you for being with us. You came all the way from Berlin, but before you came to Berlin, you stayed in Frankfurt and other places, Marburg you mentioned, but originally you're from America. So you're here as a voter from America, so representative of the American people, so to say. And then it's Tyson Barker. You're the program. No, Tyson, we already got you. And excuse me, because we have this change, and we would like to say sorry for that. But Mr. Bütikofer, he is ill, so he couldn't participate. And but therefore, Dr. Martin Thunert, you're from the Heidelberg Center for American Studies, living in Frankfurt, working in Heidelberg. It's all nearby, and you thank you very much for being with us, being so flexible. We asked you a few days ago, and you said, okay, no problem, I will be with you and take part in the panel discussion. Now I would like to hand over to Christoph, and Christoph, please ask our panelists why they are here and what they are expecting tonight.
Okay, why are you here? No, thanks first of all for having us here and for helping us to organize this wonderful panel and evening. And again, also thanks a lot towards Tyson and Alex, Martin and Hannah for joining us this evening. And maybe the first question we thought about as a little starter, so to say, what were your hopes and fears with respect to the midterms, and how do you feel afterwards? And this week they are behind us, and what are your thoughts about that? Maybe Tyson, you start.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and it's always great to be in Frankfurt. It's a city that I love. We were talking about this earlier. You know, I think like many people, the election exceeded my expectation in many ways. You know, a quote from Joe Biden that he made right after the election, he said it was a good day for democracy. And of course, you know, he's euphoric because the Democrats beat expectations in many ways, but I don't even think that's necessarily what he meant. So, I mean, some of the areas that I look at that are very positive signs for the state of U.S. democracy right now is first, the voter turnout rate. So voter turnout was around 52%, which is higher than the midterm voter turnout in 2018 during the Trump administration, where, and of course we know the U.S. is very polarized right now, but it, you know, even then that was a sea change midterm, because in the past, midterms tended to have voter turnout around 40%. And then in 2018, we had a jump to 51%. And now, even after Trump is no longer in office, we're still having extremely high voter engagement. So that's one thing to be optimistic about. And that brings me to the second point, which I think we see even after the election, is some degree growing. There's still problems, but confidence in the electoral process. People still think that their vote matters. You know, their frustration with parts of the process, but people still felt it very important to engage. And that we see in this increased voter turnout. We also see it in the fact that we had the certification of the integrity of election systems by organizations and institutions like CISA, the Department of Homeland Security's cybersecurity agency, the BSI of the United States. So, you know, a greater deal of confidence in the election. And that brings me to the third point. And of course, we're going to talk about election denialism and, you know, the big lie and voter fraud. But by and large, there's a lot more confidence in the integrity of the election process. The third great sign of hope is there wasn't the kind of political violence that some people were predicting. So the idea that, you know, armed voter observers or armed polling observers were going to lead to violence, or there were going to be contested elections that led to violence, that has not yet materialized, and it didn't materialize on election day. And the final point I would say, and this is where some of the questions come in about why were we not able to predict these results, is the composite electorate was different. We had much higher youth voter turnout, Gen Z voters, and those voters under 29, voted 28% for the Democrats, more for the Democrats than for the Republicans. So that also led to a big shift. So those are some of the initial observations I would make.
Great, thanks. And Alex, I mean, you're from the heartland in the USA. You're from Nebraska. How did you experience the elections in Nebraska, and what were your hopes, fears in that context, but also impressions afterwards?
Right. Well, thank you for having me here. My name is Alex Swanson, born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, but I've been living in Germany, taking a couple of trips throughout multiple German cities for the past couple of years. But I was recently home, so I still have very close ties to being home. And I think there are two key takeaways that I would like to share, which was super interesting, right? Because you're at home right before the election, so a lot of people don't know a lot about Nebraska, which is why, thank you so much for having us here. Nebraska has a total population of 1.8 million. We're one of two states. Maine is the other state that can split our electoral votes. And so when it comes to generally voting, Nebraska is a very rural area, lots of cattle, industry is very different, right? So it first started with telecommunications, et cetera, but that's a different discourse. But two things that I positively noticed when I was home is that compared to, back in 2020, you're not kind of seeing this violent discourse when it comes to Trump. So that means that people are being engaged and people are, not in a way, things are still very, very tense, but we can kind of finally start to talk about those issues. So I think Tyson brings these amazing points about voter engagement, but I think when it comes to the president, he's kind of settled things down, which is what we talked on our ride here. Is things are a little bit calmer, and especially in a state where, so you must know, Omaha is where I'm from, and this is the biggest city in all of Nebraska with about 400,000 inhabitants, and the rest is scattered throughout everywhere else. So this is a big sign of change. And the other thing is that people are actually, getting informed about how to register to vote, about how to get a vote-in ballot, but then also going to the polls early because you can go about 20 days early. So also voter engagement, voter awareness, and then being able to talk about the issue, which I think, or politics in general, I think has been a really positive change since the last time I was home 2 years ago.
Great, thanks a lot. And maybe in that context, I would like actually to go to the next question I was thinking about, and I'm looking towards Hannah in Washington and towards Martin, but I start with Hannah. And I was just wondering, after what Tyson and Alex just told us, were the elections more about two people, about Biden and Trump, or were they, from your point of view, more about topics? And my personal perception was it was a little bit more, I personally thought it would be a little bit more about Biden and Trump, but I thought, when watching the elections or the midterms, I had the impression it more went into topics. But what were your experiences and your impressions in that context, Hannah? And then again, afterwards, Martin.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think a lot of the analysis right before the elections was that Trump was helping Biden by making this election about him. So instead of it being a referendum on the president, it was now also a referendum on the former president. And that, of course, brought out a lot of voters who were ready to vote against Trump and who didn't want to endorse the political violence of January 6th and the lie around the election. But I think looking at the results, what you're saying is absolutely true, which is that we saw really different results state by state, which was really unusual for a midterm election. I think one of the most common examples that you're seeing is looking at states like New York and Pennsylvania, which are right next to each other. In theory, they heard very similar narratives around sort of the fight for democracy, the fight for abortion rights, but they voted completely differently. And so what I think you ended up seeing was that it really came down to the local issues that were on the ballot in states like Michigan, where the right to abortion was literally a ballot issue that voters could decide on whether or not to protect the right to abortion in the Constitution. Democratic, independent voters, young voters, women came out in big numbers from what we're seeing so far. And voted to protect not only that right, but then also voted for the Democratic candidates who supported that right up and down the ticket. Whereas in states like New York, where it didn't seem like the right to abortion was actually at risk, where the issues, the choice between Republicans and Democrats wasn't so stark, I think a lot more Democratic voters seem to have stayed home, and Republicans saw much more of the red wave that had initially been predicted. So I think in that sense, it was a much more localized midterm election than we've typically seen.
Thank you. Martin, how are your impressions in that context?
I see it in a similar way, but first let me say that as a America watcher from Germany and non-partisan, I'm happy that 9 days after the election, we have a tentative result for Congress today when we have this discussion. So we know that the House of Representatives will now be a slim Republican majority, which changes a lot. We'll certainly talk about that later. And in the Senate, irrespective of how the Georgian runoff election will end in, the Democrats keep their rather thin 50-50 plus the vice president majority, or they get one more seat. But so we have a split Congress in terms of majority. That's a result which is not completely unexpected. Regarding, was it a referendum on the former president and the incumbent president or on issues? I would say very much in keeping what Hannah said, it was both. In early October, late September, I had a chance to follow the elections, not in America, but from north of the border, Montreal and Toronto, Canada. But I was in the same time zone, and of course you could watch American TV. And as far as issues were concerned, I saw two different campaigns. The Republican campaign was about to make it a referendum on Biden, blaming him for roughly 8 to 10 or 11% inflation, and making crime and the situation on the southern border to Mexico, the admittedly chaotic situation, the main campaign issue. When you followed a Democrat campaign event, inflation, yes, it mattered to a certain extent, but the blame didn't go, of course, to President Biden, but to international political economy conundrums in the world, value chains and shortages, the war in Ukraine and so on. But then the number one issue there was abortion, 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 followed by concern about whether American democracy would be badly damaged as a result. And here, one of my hopes, and I think that hope was fulfilled, is not so much on the level of the congressional election, but on the state level. There was a certain danger, and I say this as a non-partisan observer, that certain candidates for jobs which in Germany would be Landeswahlleiter or Innenminister, so Secretary of State, Election Commission, who had already announced that they wanted, in the next election, 2024, perhaps manipulate the election to the extent that they would suppress the votes of certain people who happen to tend more towards the Democrats. And I think it's a good thing, not from a partisan perspective, but from a perspective of democracy, that most of these people on the state level did not get elected. And that was some of the things that I really liked about the election.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for that first round. And I would like to point out that Arun Nagashet is sitting over there. He's managing the online chat. You guys out there who are participating in our discussion can please write questions, and then Arun is collecting them and handing them over to us. Arun?
Yeah, I'm actually quite excited because we've got a very diverse audience tonight. We've invited so many different target groups, so that I think that could be a very interesting discussion tonight. I've seen that many guests are from Newcomers Network, international expats from all over the world, so it would be really interesting to see aspects and questions, comments coming from different nations and cultures. We have also invited traditionally the members of Montagsgesellschaft. I am inviting you, if you would like to participate in the chat, please do that. You're invited to do that in German if you want, and I'll read them in. And of course, we've got some wonderful people here in the room, and I know that Europäische Schule Rhein-Main has invited parents, teachers to come. So as well here in the room, we're inviting you to join the discussion. Let's not make this a one-way discussion on the stage only, but please, if you've got comments or if you've got any questions, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to moderate the questions in. We don't have any questions right now, so we go back to the panel, but I'll raise my hand if there's anything from the chat.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks again to our panel for this first round. And I just thought we already talked about the topics which were of relevance in the midterms. You mentioned inflation, you mentioned abortion, and a little bit Ukraine, and also the trust in democracy. I was just wondering, what's about China? What's about the Indo-Pacific region? What's about climate change and transatlantic relations? Those are all a lot of themes which often play also a role from a German perspective with respect to elections. Which role did they play in the US? Hannah, what was your experience or your observation in that context?
I don't think they played much of a role, to be honest. I mean, what we can talk about maybe is the effect that the new Congress now has on these issues. But in general, foreign policy doesn't play much of a role in American elections. And that was true even with the war in Ukraine, which, I mean, the difference between, when you're in Germany and it feels so close and you see people from Ukraine, in Europe who are directly affected versus in so many places in the US where it just feels very far away, and had not, until the few weeks right before the election, it had not become a politicized issue. There was still really high support in general on both sides of the aisle for supporting Ukraine. So in that sense, it was not an issue. I think the climate issue is a little bit different. We're still not seeing climate elections in the US the way we are in Europe, even though it's one of the top issues for young voters. And so I think we did see voter turnout. We saw young voters turn out almost at the rate at which they turned out in 2018, which was an incredibly high participation of young voters in that election when they came to vote against Trump. And I think one of the reasons we saw young voters turn out is because shortly before the election, Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a huge climate bill. And that was celebrated by young people as a huge step forward, the first time in years and years that the US had passed climate legislation. And so I think young voters recognize that. If you want, we can talk a little bit more about the implications of the new Congress for the foreign policy issues that you raised around China, around transatlantic relations. But in terms of the role they played in the campaign, it was not significant.
Okay, thanks. And Alex, what do you think in Nebraska? How did you see it there?
Yeah, I was just nodding my head quite a bit. I mean, to kind of, paint the picture again of Nebraska, we're a completely landlocked state. I think we're actually one of the states that's landlocked by 3 different other states, right? But when we talk about other topics that were discussed, it was gun control, it was illegal immigration, so making sure that our borders are secure, which is funny, from a geographical perspective, I guess, with regards to Nebraska being concerned about borders, but then also inflation. So one of the topic, the ballot issues was not with regards to abortion, but with regards to raising minimum wage. So raising it from $9.25 to $14 an hour by 2024. So very different topics. And I think when we think about so much of the U.S., and that's why it's really nice to have a Nebraskan perspective here, or kind of a Midwestern perspective, heartland perspective, is a lot of these blue collar workers or people in these very rural areas feel as though they've been disenchanted for a very long time, right? Which is kind of what led to 2020. So I can only really kind of agree and shake my head to what Hannah was saying. But there's no traction for a lot of these issues. When you watch the news, we're talking about very different things.
I think it was strange after the midterms. I think everybody expected a Republican red wave, and were thinking that election deniers would play a larger role, or conspiracy theories would be a relevant matter in that context. And now sitting here, I think we're realizing that it wasn't a wave; it was more a ripple, something small, nothing really big turning out there with respect to the Republican wave. But what do you think? What were the reasons for so many experts sort of seeing not in that way in which it developed eventually? Why didn't they see sort of a different turnout of the midterms?
To me, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is, I think that the modeling that was done for the potential electorate was off in some ways. In order to predict what's going to happen, in order to have polling, you have to have polling that reflects the actual electorate that's going to come out and vote. And that didn't necessarily happen. We had a lot more Gen Z voters than was expected, for example. I think another point that's really important to make when we talk about the red wave, or why wasn't there a red wave, is the issue that was mentioned earlier about this being quite local and quite regional. I think it was also very segmented. So even on questions around foreign policy, I think that there were areas where it did play a role, in fact. For example, in the election in Ohio for the Senate, there were a lot of campaign ads cut around China, particularly hostility towards China as an economic competitor. A lot of that tends to be a proxy for free trade policies of the past, but it still does play a role in certain areas. We also had, and this is something that Hannah and I discussed a couple of weeks ago, but you had, a lot of election narratives circulating in Spanish-speaking language media around socialism. And that was specifically meant to trigger certain tropes that are associated with people like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela or the government in Cuba. So, it's not necessarily that it's a kind of hard policy issue that's taking center stage in the election, but the international valence has a role. Even with the Republicans coming into office, we all expect that there are going to be investigations. It's pretty much the only thing that they can agree on is investigations and oversight in House committees. And one of the areas that they're very interested in investigating, and they made quite a big point of this, especially on right-wing media, are Hunter Biden's ties to international interests, specifically in Ukraine and China. So I don't think that we can definitely say that, yes, was that the top issue that people were talking about? No, it was inflation, it was crime, it was abortion, it was democracy, and it was education. I think those are the top 5. But it still was in this kind of composite voting area. You asked, why isn't there a red wave? We saw a red wave in Florida. You know, we saw, in what was ostensibly a swing state, top ticket statewide candidates win by 15 to 20 points. We saw counties like Miami-Dade, which is a traditionally very, very Democratic county, or Palm Beach County, both go for the Republicans for the first time. And these are also Hispanic majority counties. So things are happening. In New York, we heard 5 Democratic seats lost to the Republicans in just that state alone. It's a state that Trump didn't play so much of a role, and the kind of MAGA ideology didn't play a role. The other thing I think is worth noting is the places where candidates were able to emancipate themselves, to remove themselves from the MAGA ideology in the Republican Party, be it Ron DeSantis, be it Brian Kemp in Georgia, or Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, the Secretary of State candidate, or be it in Ohio with Mike DeWine, you had people running and winning at quite a high level for the Republicans. So, I think that the real thing to talk about is not was it a wave or not, but how much of a drag was Trump and MAGA on Republican candidates?
Hannah, how strong and how intensive are people discussing politics in the street? How many panel discussions of whatever kind of circles are there going on in the communities? How big is the topic politics in the American people? How interested are they, or do most of them don't really care?
It's huge. Although I'm in Washington, D.C., so my perspective is always a little bit biased because politics is everyone's job here in D.C.
Okay.
But no, I mean, I think it's significant. The challenge, of course, is it's becoming increasingly difficult to disentangle politics from any other issue. So at this point, the type of TV you watch, whether or not you're vegetarian, really any issue, your stance on reproductive rights, your stance on criminal justice, your stance on voting rights, your stance on whether student loan debt should be forgiven, on climate, on China. I mean, China actually is maybe the only one, but there's such a range of issues that in theory could affect people's everyday lives. And all of them are by now politicized. And so it becomes very hard to have conversations that are not political because every issue is now partisan and is sort of divided between these two camps. So I think it is an issue. What I would say is, I don't think people across the country are necessarily paying attention to what's happening in Washington all the time. I think that is probably a very small minority of people who, are actually paying attention, who necessarily know who their representatives are. There's a difference, I think, between the feeling of partisan tribalism and sort of a sense of belonging to a certain part of the country versus actually closely following political developments in Washington.
And one more question. What would you say, Alex, is the difference between situation in America and in Germany concerning the interest rate of average people in politics and young people especially?
That's a really good question. I think to go back to something, Hannah, what you were just saying, 2 words that I learned when I was home, the plandemic, of course. I'm not sure if you've heard this one. This is, a big one. And then it's not, but it's more of a saying of, let's go Brandon, is kind of a slur towards Joe Biden. And every discussion is, of course not everybody's the same, but is becoming, very political of like, oh, well, you're just a liberal if you drink oat milk or something like that. So it's very difficult, and sometimes, it's meant in a very light manner. But I think when it comes to political engagement, I think the U.S. and Germany have fundamentally different discussions when it comes to that. I mean, the topic of, foundations, right? So how do you foster discourse at a level that even allows for that? So making sure that we have room and spaces like this is a way to discuss such topics. But I think when it comes to actual engagement, or Hannah, what you're talking about actually going deep into the topic, I think that this is super low. You're kind of coming from a helicopter level of just wanting to be able to engage in the conversation. So that's what happens when that's what you can do with vocabulary, with words like pandemic or a liberal agenda or gun control, et cetera, as a way to be a part of it. So I think we have a lot to do when it comes to getting our younger generation involved in such discussions.
I see Arun, and Arun is waving, and saying that there's questions in the chat.
Yeah, someone come in with a little bit of a time gap, so maybe I'm ruining the structure of the discussion, so please feel free to set it back if you want to. The one comment came in when you talked about how the elections actually went, and there was a comment here that in fact several incidents have been reported in recent days around Phoenix, Arizona, where voting stations were under surveillance by armed individualists. Question here from the chat: who or what is the reason? Whether that would be, whether you'd be aware or heard about that. That was one question or a remark from Sonja Kraus. And we've got a second question here, totally different area. Given that the midterms were also interpreted as a vote for or against the current president, do you see him campaigning maybe against Trump? If not, what would be other potential candidates? So totally different area to discuss. I'm keeping it open if who in the panel would like to take up on any of the subjects. Would be lovely.
Martin?
Well, I can take about the second question. In addition to having a result today, we also have the first formal announcement as a candidate for the 2024 election, and which is the 45th president, Donald J. Trump. So what impact will this have? I think I agree with what Tyson said earlier, that Trump is no longer seen by many of the Republican voters, probably 50, 60%, as their potentially strongest candidate in 2024. But, and that's a big but, he has a movement. He has a MAGA movement. And that movement may only be 30 to 40% of Republican voters. Trump actually never had more than that. His approval rating was also never higher than 40%. So we'll see how that will play out. I don't expect any other candidate, with the exception of former Vice President Mike Pence, who is no longer a friend of Donald Trump, to also declare his candidacy. I don't think DeSantis will do this. He's a governor now. He has important work to do, and other potential contenders for the Republican side are also office holders, many of them, with a few exceptions. I think that for Biden, this gives him a chance. First of all, the elections didn't go as badly as people thought, so no red wave. Secondly, he can say again, I beat Trump in 2020. I would have beaten him in 2016 if I had been the candidate and not Hillary, and I can do it again. So in a way, I think that Trump's candidacy makes it easier for Biden at least to remain agnostic for a little while, because imagine also from a foreign policy, from a German or European perspective, if Joe Biden said in a couple of weeks, I will not run in 2024, how would this sound to Mr. Xi in Beijing, or let alone to Mr. Putin in, he would be the leader of the country that is the most important country supporting Ukraine, not just militarily, but also in more economic and civilian respects. How would that look? So he would certainly weaken the negotiating position of NATO, of Western countries, and perhaps of the Ukrainian side. So he won't do that. But now he has probably a stronger claim to say, yes, I will be 82 years old should I be reelected, which sounds scary to a lot of people. Trump will be, I think, 78 if he became president again. But he can say, I have demonstrated that I can beat the guy. And will other candidates, will Kamala Harris, who certainly would be a candidate, be able to do that? Would Governor Newsom of California, who had an excellent re-election, two-thirds majority almost in California, will they be able to do that? Perhaps. But so I think, at least in the short term, it has strengthened Biden's position, at least to say nothing about whether he will be run, and put this off for at least a year or so.
Hannah, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, if I could just add on, I agree that I think this has really strengthened Biden's hand in making the case that he should be able to run again. I still think there's enormous pressure within the Democratic Party and among the Democratic base for him not to run again. If you look at polls among young voters who were decisive in this election, they made the difference in places like Georgia and Nevada, where the races were razor thin. More than 90% of young voters desperately want someone else to run. They want a new generation. And just minutes before we got onto this call, Nancy Pelosi announced that she would be stepping back as Speaker of the House. And I don't know for sure. I mean, from everything I've heard from Democrats close to Biden, he wants to run again. I think it would be hard to persuade him not to. But I do wonder if he will at least think again after Pelosi's step back, that maybe, you know, her signal, and she said this very explicitly, that it's time for a new generation of Democratic leadership, that it's time to open the field so that other people can start to build a profile, and they need time to do that. He would need to announce soon. I wonder if it could also lead him to reflect on his own choices. I don't think Kamala Harris has any chance of being the nominee. She, in her last campaign, ran a terribly weak campaign, never got more than 2 or 3%. I would be very, very surprised. She's not made a profile for herself as the vice president. She's practically out of the news. I mean, more or less invisible, even though she has a portfolio that on issues like immigration, voting rights would in theory give her a huge platform to make a name for herself, and she just hasn't managed to do it. So I think the names, I think Gavin Newsom was mentioned, the governor of California. Gretchen Whitmer's name has been floated. There are people out there who I think would make good candidates, but Biden has to, you know, give them the space to do that. And I'm not confident that he wouldn't necessarily be challenged. I think that's an open question. On the Republican side, I would be shocked if Ron DeSantis didn't run. I think this last election made the case for him for why, when every other, you know, Republican who was supported by Trump failed, he, who managed to keep his distance from Trump, not only won by a 20 percentage point margin, but got the entire Republican ticket in Florida to win in a state that, I mean, Tyson said this earlier, used to be a swing state. So I think Ron DeSantis has made it very clear that he wants to run. I think we'll see him. I hope we can take some time also in this discussion to talk about this narrative that's emerging in Washington, that the Republicans who won were not extremists, that this was sort of a rejection of extremist, MAGA, Trump-supported candidates. And I think that's a narrative we want to be very careful with, because when you look at the policies of Ron DeSantis in Florida, Brian Kemp in Georgia, they're not Trump, and that's an important nuance. You know, they are not endorsing political violence like what we saw on January 6th, but they're also not small d Democrats. They have worked systematically to undermine the democratic system. They've taken incredibly extreme positions on LGBT issues. Kemp assigned a ban on abortion after 6 weeks, so it's for all intents and purposes, it's a ban, full ban on abortion. So these are not, you know, liberal Democrats in the European sense, and I think that's something that is. They're being presented right now as sort of mainstream moderates, and I think that's not a narrative we want to endorse.
Yeah, maybe Hannah, you mentioned Ron DeSantis, and I think we've read a lot about Ron DeSantis during the last days, also in the German media, but of course also in international media and in The Guardian, New York Times, and so on. But who are the other contenders next to Ron DeSantis with respect to Trump? Who are the other relevant persons where you would say they might sort of go for presidency in the US?
Yeah, the two other names I've heard floated, but Tyson, maybe you can jump in and say more as well. I think Mike Pence still thinks that he has a good chance. I don't think he does, but I think he will run. And Mike Pompeo is the other person who has clearly said that he would like to run. I think, you know, similarly wants to sort of tout his experience in the White House, his military experience. Again, I don't think either of them have a realistic chance. I think it's likely, from what we know now, to come down to Ron DeSantis versus Trump, with Ron DeSantis essentially using a lot of Trump-like narratives, but not as erratic a candidate, someone who can present himself as a bit more socially acceptable, but de facto pushes for many of the same extreme policies. And I mean, even, you know, if you think about the stunt that Ron DeSantis pulled this summer, when they were trying to distract from the whole debate about abortion, Ron DeSantis flew refugees who had arrived in Florida from Venezuela to Washington, D.C., to Martha's Vineyard, to Chicago, to New York, dropped them off on the doorsteps of the Democrats, and sort of tried to generate media attention around this by essentially saying, you know, if you like immigrants so much, you take them. Which is, you know, from a European perspective, I think you would compare it with the way that Lukashenko has instrumentalized immigrants and refugees and sort of completely disrespected human rights. So again, I think he is not as different from Trump as we would like to think.
I think we have to, thank you very much, Hannah. We have to watch the time a little bit. It's 20 minutes left. I would also invite you as the audience in the room to participate in the discussion and to ask questions. And would like to ask you on the panel to answer with short answers. And I see Arun is coming up with a question or something.
What we traditionally do is when we send out the invites, for example, to Montags, I think I've seen it, for the Montagsgesellschaft participants, is that they come back with written comments or with written answers. Obviously, that was before the elections. So when we sent out the invite, that was before the elections. But most of the questions which came, or with the comments which came, were from a German perspective. So if we could use a little bit of the time to have a discussion towards what does it mean for Germany, what is it from the German perspective? We had a question or even a comment, what is a worst case scenario or what is a best case scenario? So those were the discussions which went on in the written conversation when we had the Montagsgesellschaft interfered. And I've seen one question for here. I'm not sure, shall we go for the German subject? Shall we go for questions first?
Go for the question.
Perfect.
And then we
Excellent.
Take a look at
I'll
German
go close if Lucas doesn't stop me, because there may be technical issues if I go too close, but I'll bring the microphone in front.
Okay. Good. Is okay?
Yes.
Well, it's a little bit going backwards because it's a very fundamental question. Where do you take the confidence that after all manipulations in the last 5 to 8 years, I think it's even longer, with the American voting system, in particular this gimbering or designing your voting counties around your voters, making voting registration, making voting difficult, like in one state where you can't even approach a voter who obviously is in distress and give him something, and then you have to fear reprimations, and in particular for minorities, colored people. Like I think in one state there is the notion that someone who is even American citizen but is colored is questioned if he really should be a voter. There's actually a law, I think, in that parliament, and so on, and that the US at large, a state on federal level, is really a functional democracy. And I define democracy not only with voting rights, but also with having an independent executive, or executive, I think is the term, and legislative. In particular, I think of all these manipulations on federal court and the Supreme Court level. Yeah.
Maybe Martin or Thorsten?
Yeah, I must say that I will probably have to agree to disagree that the United States of America is not a democracy. I vehemently disagree with you. I think to vote directly for a president is probably rather a sign of democracy than to have it get elected through a parliamentary system, in my point of view. But we can agree or disagree. Also, as the citizens of a country that at the moment has to repeat an entire state election because of inept administrators in Berlin and part of the Bundestag election, I'm a bit more hesitant to criticize the United States on that. Notwithstanding that, there are concrete problems in some states. I mentioned a few. That's what I said. I'm happy that some of these electoral officers were not elected, which openly had announced that they would do things like do. From our perspective, the federal level only only gives sort of a framework in the Voting Rights Act. So that elections have to be conducted a certain day, and the voting booth have to stay open about 8 or 9 hours. But the states can do a lot, and the things that you describe, and there we don't disagree. There are practices like you're not allowed in the state of Georgia to give somebody waiting in line when it's hot something to drink. That is preposterous. We don't have to discuss that. But that's only in Georgia, to my knowledge, this particular rule. So you have to really look at individual states, and there are, I think, good signs, and that brings us back to this former question of Arizona. Yes, there were also practices that I would also not approve of, armed people, sort of intimidating people when they go to the voting booth, but apparently the result in Arizona is that the Trump candidates for governor and for Senate didn't win. So my judgment on American democracy is really more mixed, and we have to point to the particular problems instead of sort of declaring, I think, with a little bit too much self-confidence that the United States is not a democracy anymore.
Tyson, would you agree?
I mean, of course, I agree that the U.S. is a robust democracy. I mean, there are definitely worrying signs. Everything that you mentioned is correct. For me, the threshold for voting has become much more difficult. I'm from Texas, and I have to re-register living in Germany every year. That used not to be the case. You could register for 4 years. I have to re-register at the beginning of the year every year. Because I said I don't know when I'm going to come back, I wasn't allowed to vote in any state elections. I was only allowed to vote for one election, which was for my congressman in a district that is already, where the outcome is already determined. The most important thing, though, I think that you mentioned was gerrymandering, which is the idea that voters don't pick their representatives, but the representatives pick their voters in the way they manipulate the districts so that the outcome is already pre-baked into the system. You see a state like Wisconsin, and it's virtually impossible to dislodge. It becomes very difficult unless you have court intervention or some other form of intervention that would allow that to be worked out. And that, is a hot debate at the federal level and in the courts, but it is a deteriorating dimension of U.S. democracy, that's for sure.
Okay, see that there's a question in the audience. Oh, it's Laura.
So I don't have a question to someone specific, but I have a more general question. So the younger generation was mentioned a couple of times as being actually quite important in this upcoming election, especially by Hannah. I think you mentioned it 2 times. I have to say, I find it really frightening. I'm not part of Generation Z, so I'm over 30, but still. I find it really frightening that we're still talking about abortion rights and things that should be a deal of the past, I have to say. I lived in the US for 6 years total. I went there in 2009, and it was an issue in 2009, and it still is an issue in 2022, and it's the same topics again. And I feel like the world has really shifted and changed. We're in the middle of a climate crisis. And I feel like this is not being discussed in these elections at all. And to me, it's really a sign of the candidates that are sort of putting themselves on the stage, which is Joe Biden, who's over 80, and then Trump the same, right? How come that over the past years, neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party have actually managed to put these topics on the top of their agenda and also then select candidates or build up candidates, right? Because we all know in the US it's all about money, but then fund candidates who can actually purport these issues that are globally really important. Because currently, from a German perspective, I have to say that the US election feels like a totally isolated world, like we're living on a different planet, right? We're talking about abortion and gun control. It's so backwards to the new generation. We're not talked to at all, right? For us, it's climate change. It's really like making sure that the kids that we might have one day are going to actually still live on Earth, right? And what are we going to do with all of these climate refugees coming from Africa, right? These are the topics that we should discuss. And why are we still talking about abortion rights and gun control? And how come that there's no new candidate on the horizon that is sort of tackling these issues and bringing some fresh air?
I think that's a question for you.
Yeah, I mean, Laura, I can't see you, but I share what you're saying. I just want to maybe push back against the idea that this is isolated. We just had elections in Sweden and Italy that did not go, in the direction of liberal democracy, and where I think you see really similar patterns of right-wing movements creating problems that are not real problems. Making family values the most urgent issue for Italian voters, when I think there are a lot more urgent issues that need to be solved. But the tactic of right-wing movements is to create problems that they can fix. So in the US, it's to create a huge cultural debate around whether or not the tiny number of children who identify as trans can join a sports team that matches their gender identity. It's, I'm sure it's an important issue for those children. It's really not an important issue for society at large to grapple with when you have something like the climate crisis. But it's very effective if your goal is not to solve problems, but to scare people into voting, primarily on the basis of emotion and fear. And so I think that the challenge for Democrats has been that somehow these right-wing movements have done that very effectively. They've instrumentalized a whole host of cultural issues very effectively. Trump, of course, at the very best. And so it becomes really hard when you're constantly on defense against those narratives to put forward a positive agenda. I think Biden, and the Democrats tried to do that in these first 2 years by focusing on the Inflation Reduction Act. They focused on socioeconomic issues with student loan relief, which is a huge issue for young voters here in the US. They focused on things like redefining marijuana, which is a huge racial justice issue around criminal justice. So they're trying. But I mean, yeah, it's hard when you have a really powerful right-wing movement. I would just again urge you to question whether that's really just in the US that we're confronting that struggle.
We got one more question coming up over there.
Yes, my name is Andreas Powell. I just want to refer to Hannah's comment on how important the Ukraine subject is or not. I absolutely agree that the Ukraine subject was in particularly for the people voting for the Republicans in the middle of the United States are not really of an important issue. The issue most pressing was and still is the invasion through Mexico to America. Now, since we have, as of today, the Republicans having the majority in the Representative House, the question in the room, what will be the policy and the action of the Republicans in the Representative House? Biden is going to be a lame duck, so to speak, even if the Republicans have only a few votes more than the Democrats. But would the Republicans really question the involvement of the United States in the Ukraine? Would they limit the finance of the Ukraine? Will they tie the finance of the Ukraine to a budget of a wall to be planned and built in the south of America? So what will be the reaction, what will be the action of the Republicans taking charge and advantage of the slight majority in the Representative House?
Martin, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we're speculating a little bit, but the majority, as you said, we don't know whether to be a 3-seat or 5-seat majority, but it will big enough to change the entire, it's a majoritarian system, so all the committee chairmanships will go to the Republicans in the House of Representatives. So consequence number 1, the January 6th commission will end when this Congress ends on January the 2nd or the 3rd. So they have to wrap it up now because there will be no majority in the Republican Party to continue it. They might have some investigative committees on Hunter Biden and his activities and a few others. I think there's maybe a third of Republicans in the House want to impeach President Biden, but they would need every single vote to do that. It would be payback to the impeachments of Trump, and I think I'm not quite sure under which legal pretense they would do it. It would probably be the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan or negligence because of the border situation. But I don't think it will get the majority within the party. Regarding Ukraine, we had cross-party majorities for all the aid packages. There are Republicans, especially in the Senate, who were critical of it, but luckily some of those who ran for the Senate and didn't want the help to continue weren't elected. And we have about 30 Democrats who had issued a letter, which then they withdrew, to ask basically President Biden to push more for negotiations. So I think that overall majority will continue. But what will be happening to us here in Europe is when you see what the United States spent on Ukraine and what you see what Europeans even together spend, there is an imbalance. And I think the voices in the United States will say, why can rich Europe not do more? They will get louder, especially on the side of the Republican majority in the House, but I think also among some centrist Democrats.
Do you have numbers? What was the difference between whole European engagement and US engagement?
I don't have this statistic with me now, I'm sorry, but it's still, in weapons, it's immense.
Yeah.
But even if you count the entire aid package, it's still immense. I think it's bigger than the European Union together, plus a few other countries. So from a, I guess, as Mr. Paul said, from a look of somebody in the middle of the United States, maybe in Nebraska, a farmer or so, they will say, why can't they do more? Yeah, why can't they do more?
Exactly, and so I mean, going back to the other question is, you know, when we're talking about these huge global issues, whenever you go back, it's like you feel, I always call it America mind, right? So I go home and it's like the world does not stop, but you are consumed with yourself, and so it's like to have any connection or context of like the Ukraine or, you know, what's going on in Russia or, you know, what is Germany's gas, you know, issue looking like? These are just completely foreign topics, and so. And you know, it's easy for me to say that, but what this means essentially for the average American is, you know, they're focusing on very different topics, right? They're much more concerned about how much is it going to cost to fill up their tank of gas, right? And they know that it's now double the price. They know that they're earning less and their dollar isn't getting them as far, right? So those are some of the other topics.
Well, yeah, thank you. Although I think it's interesting what you're saying because I just remember there was a movie or film produced by Obama about, I think, 3 years ago. It was actually about a Chinese company which bought an American company, and it was kind of a clash of cultures. And but also this film showed to me in some way the relevance of foreign influence, foreign policies with respect to regional matters, so to say. And so it's interesting for me that the region and the people in the respective states, the people in the cities, in Nebraska, for example, that they didn't sort of see the relevance of foreign policies or foreign politics with respect to how they affect them at their place. Tyson, you have thoughts about that?
I mean, this is not the election of 2002, where, you know, 9/11 and the kind of run-up to the Iraq War was really front and center in the midterm elections. It plays a secondary role. In some ways, it plays a kind of atmospheric role. But there are kind of foreign policy overlays into some of the domestic issues. I mean, one of the strong streaks in the United States, particularly in the Midwest, is an isolationist streak, and this is actually bipartisan. There has been, even in the 60s and 70s, senators like Mansfield, from Montana wanted to lighten the footprint of the United States in Europe. So this continues. I think we'll continue to have that kind of isolationist push in certain areas of the country. You're going to hear, why can't we invest that money at home? Aid packages will be smaller. Oversight will be greater. You know, there was a large Benghazi hearing, investigative hearing, took up a lot of time in the last Republican Congress when Obama was in office. We could see something very similar, not just with relationship to Hunter Biden, but the prosecution of Ukraine's effort, or in China, or the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Those are all possibilities, and of course the border situation. And as was mentioned, even if Republicans support Ukraine in a robust way, like they do, they're going to try to make it conditional on getting something in return, just like they tried to do with the CHIPS Act, which they passed with Democrats, and tried to make that conditional on not passing the Inflation Reduction Act, and infrastructure. And just like they're going to try to do, I think, this is the indication, with the debt ceiling, where it's, of course, in the US interest broadly to raise the debt ceiling to make sure that we're standing behind US credit, but they want to get concessions from the White House on that.
All right, we're actually running out of time, but Andreas, one more question from your side.
Is the challenge for Europe and in particularly for Germany. The United States has America first, we all agree, which is domestically and which is also foreign affairs related. They have Trans-Pacific second, which is also something where everyone would agree. And then there's quite a period of time, nothing. And then Europe comes third, 55 billion investment for basically the Ukraine is, so to speak, peanuts with regards to for keeping up the democracy worldwide. The Europeans have a real challenge with the problem the representative house has, where the Republicans have the majority now. And the problem really is what you are saying, in particular, that the Republicans want to have a tribute for providing security to Europe, providing security to Ukraine. And the tribute is 2% plus investment for NATO with regard to the gross national product. It is basically buy American military equipment in order to also reduce the enormous trade deficit Germany in particular has with the United States. And thirdly, Germany has to work more on the deficit situation, on the trade deficit situation, and also they need to reduce and limit the business relation macro-wise with China. This is a tribute the Republicans will enforce, having now even a slight only a slight majority in the representative house. So this is a real challenge for Germany, a real challenge for Europe.
Which is probably helping us to come to the last question for all of you. And we would like to ask you for a short last statement on the meaning of the midterms election and the situation in America, which is going on at the moment, meaning for Germany, especially, maybe also European Union, but especially since we are in Germany, especially since we are talking about German-American relations. What is the meaning of the midterms election and the situation in America for Germany at the moment and maybe during the next few years? What do you, or does Germany not matter at all in America at the moment? What is the situation like? Who would like to start? Maybe Hannah, you?
Sure. My sense is that Europe in general, not just Germany, has been granted 2 more years of relative continuity and of a really strong transatlanticist in the White House. And that it needs to use those 2 years really wisely, because it's entirely possible that you have a Republican president who does not have that kind of commitment coming in 2024. So right now with the Senate, you will continue to see sort of the basic bureaucracy of foreign policy continue. We'll have ambassadorships filled. Biden can continue to rebuild the State Department, which was completely decimated under the Trump administration. It sounds very bureaucratic, but what it means is that the partners are still in place to work closely with Europe. And the things that they need to get done in the next 2 years are really big. They, for example, on the Inflation Reduction Act, which is supposed to finally build up a green tech industry in the US, that's really important. It's something Europe had called for. It also has a lot of protectionist measures that are not good for, especially for Germany's green tech industry. And so using these next 2 years to negotiate and put in place compromises before the next administration comes are going to be really important for European industry, but also for sort of a partnership on climate. Similarly, using these next 2 years to really invest in European security. It's not going to work for much longer for Europe to depend on the US out of a place of weakness for security protection. What the US is asking of Europe is to be a strong partner that can take over a lot of the crisis management in the European neighborhood so that the US can shift attention to the Indo-Pacific and to China. And that partnership is only going to work if Germany begins to take a lead within Europe. So I think what Germany does in these next 2 years, what Europe does to finally start to be able to make more cohesive foreign policy decisions at the EU level is going to be really decisive. And other than that, it's going to be a fair amount of gridlock in terms of domestic politics, a lot of distraction in terms of domestic politics with all of the investigations that we're likely to expect in the House with a Trump presidential run again. And so I think there's going to have to be a lot of focus from European partners to keep sort of steadily working on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think losing midterm elections is not a sign how the elections for the presidency end in 2 years. Bill Clinton had a huge red wave against him, and he was easily reelected in '96. Obama had a huge loss in 2010. That was a real red wave, and he won relatively easily in 2012. So I would make no predictions, irrespective of who the candidates are, how the presidential election ends. For Germany, I think in these two laws that especially Tyson, but also Hannah, and I think also Alex mentioned, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, there are things that are good and they are bad. I think the good things are America wants to bring value chains home. And this sounds like America first, but there's also a phenomenon called friendshoring, which means that you don't give it it's the opposite of what we did with China. We basically lost our solar industry to China and so on, and you contract everything out. You contract it out to friends. So, and of course, I slightly disagree. I don't think Europe is that unimportant for the Americans. Yes, the Indo-Pacific strategy is more, but doesn't make us irrelevant. So that's a good thing. The bad thing is that at the moment, America can give certain German companies in the neighborhood where I work is BASF, who are heavily energy dependent. And energy here is not just expensive, it's expensive in America too, but here it's scarce and it's not there. So we will see that parts of German industry will find much more attractive conditions in the United States in the next few years. And that's a real threat. And so I think this is a short-term threat next to the burden-sharing discussion on Ukraine that will come up again. And yes, it's an era of divided government again, and that means making concessions between the parties, but also, and here I would agree with Hannah, that because it's such a slim majority in the House, the more moderate Republicans have to make concessions to the Freedom Caucus, or the Tea Party or Freedom Caucus, which are more the libertarian / Orbanist wing of the party, and in order to get this 220 or 218 votes that they need. So I think it's indeed a very, really interesting time, both domestically but also for us until the presidential election in 2 years.
Tyson, what, or maybe you want to go first, or Tyson, do you want to go first?
You looked very deep in thought.
Well, I'll be very brief.
Please try to point out the meaning for Germany and for Europe.
Yeah, two things. I think continuity is a big thing. Congress is important, but the presidency and the White House still make foreign policy. The second thing is, you know, this president is, first of all, the most Atlanticist president that we've seen in my lifetime, definitely since the end of the Cold War. He's doing more to invest in the U.S.-European relationship, EU relationship, than any president, including Obama and Trump, and Clinton. And he has this issue of foreign policy for the middle class, and so it has to deliver something. So it's time for Germany and Europe to think about how can this pay dividends for these American voters, so that when or if Biden goes to the polls again in 2024, he can say, this is why I did this.
And on a very fun note, I think as an American living in Germany, this makes my life for the next 2 years very easy. We'll see what happens after the next 2 years if Trump gets reelected. But for now, we'll definitely enjoy it here. And I think when it comes to continuity, Germany and the Europeans should use that time right now as a grace period and hopefully make the best out of it.
Christoph, you would like to say the last word?
Well, thanks a lot for that, and I can only say thanks for this very enriching discussion, which we could enjoy with you. Thanks a lot, and thanks also for the interesting questions from our audience. And yeah, we hope to see each other again sometime soon, and thanks for this evening. Thank you very much.
And so I say the last word now.
Welcome.
Thank you. And from Montagsgesellschaft and from Newcomers Network, we would also like to say thank you. This is not the final event for this year from Montagsgesellschaft, also neither from Newcomers Network. Arun, what is coming up with Newcomers Network?
And Newcomers Network is doing a lot of work with the expats here in Frankfurt and Rhein-Main, and we'll do something very exciting. We're going to cook. That means we're going to have a cooking event in the kitchen of Amt für multikulturelle Angelegenheiten, which is in Gallus, very centrally in Frankfurt. And I think we've got like 30 spaces available to cook. I think it'll be Pakistani dishes, and it'll be fun to cook and eat together. So looking forward to that. If you are interested to see what Newcomers Network does for the international community, we try to gather at least once a month, try to be interactive, informative. We have a newsletter, so more than welcome to sign up for the newsletter. That's our plan for December now.
And the plan for December for Montagsgesellschaft is that we talk about engagement in the city of Frankfurt as a role model for other cities in Germany. We'll be participating, or we will talking to social foundations who are engaging themselves in the city of Frankfurt, and this is actually part of the DNA of Frankfurt society, and that's what we're going to discuss shortly before Christmas.
I think it's Monday before Christmas, so hopefully people will be still in and not traveling back home and anywhere else. Talking about social engagement and social Stiftungen, we have a big thank you for Heinrich-Böll Stiftung tonight.
Yes.
People here in the room can see that we've really built up a real television station with very professional camera equipment, going online on YouTube channel, getting people in and out into the discussion. And Heinrich-Böll Stiftung has really made that available for us. It's quite at a cost. That's an investment, and we appreciate. And thank you very much for Heinrich-Böll Stiftung for making this possible. Lukas and his team, very professional as always.
And last word is goes to Gerhard Wiesinger, who is honorable member of the Montagsgesellschaft. He's been working for the US consulate for many years, I think, and you came up with the idea that we should have the panel discussion about the midterm elections. Gerhard, thank you very much.
And we are at European School Rhein-Main, and we love to be here. Thank you for the hospitality. Thank you, Daniela and the team, for really helping us a lot in arranging this. I know technical people, Hausmeister, everybody being engaged and so on. It's been between a magician in the afternoon and I think very, very busy times tomorrow. So thank you for hosting us. We always feel very, very welcome, very, very happy to be here. Thanks again for having us.
Okay, this is it. Thank you.